So I wanted to add a couple of things to this week's instruction just to talk about the different methods that you're going to be reading about. And these are methods, again, for establishing cause and effect. And so they're good research methods for saying this particular intervention caused this outcome. And you really can't say that with a lot of research methods except for these ones. Especially experimental research is the one that people say is the gold standard for establishing cause and effect. But we're going to start talking about causal comparative research. And in causal comparative research, you basically determine the cause for existing differences among your subjects. If it's human subjects, then you're going to find causes for the differences that they exhibit. And you're going to start with the effects and seek to find a cause. So again, you're going to start with something that might have happened and maybe look for what makes those individuals who are the same, what makes them have that same result. And you can also select groups that are different and then attempt to determine the cause of the difference, or that's what you do anyway. You select groups that are different and then attempt to determine why one group is different than another. And so an example might be, lung cancer among people who smoke. And this is a great old vintage picture, unfortunately, of someone, very young person using a cigar. And if you think about it, you're probably not going to manipulate things like smoking. You're not going to be like in an experiment where you say, okay, I've got 50 people here, you 25 need to start smoking right now. And when you're done in 6 weeks of smoking, we'll check your lungs and see how healthy they are. And you 25 don't smoke, and we'll see how healthy you are. Well, that would be unethical to make somebody do something that might be detrimental to their health. So instead, with causal comparative research, you take people who are existing already in the group. So you might look at somebody who is a group of 50 people, let's say, who are smoking, and a group of 50 people who are not smoking. And you try to find groups that are much the same in other variables except for the smoking variables. So you might find things like they're all a certain age, they're all the same age from all the groups, they're all the same maybe height, weight, they're all the same type of exercise that they engage in each week. And then you compare them on something like lung cancer or overall health. And maybe from that you can determine that, hey, smoking is really detrimental to your health. So that would be an example of manipulating a variable. You can't manipulate a variable in causal comparative research for certain reasons, and so you can't manipulate a variable, so you use causal comparative research. Another one would be accidents, right? You might say, well, you people get into accidents, you people don't get into accidents, and then we'll see what your psychological well-being is a year later. Well, that's not going to work. You're not going to, again, tell people they have to be a part of a car accident. And so instead what you might do is find a group of people who have been involved in car accidents and find a similar group of people who have not, but are similar in other ways, as similar as you can get them to be with people who have experienced car accidents, and then measure both of their psychological well-being to determine whether car accidents have some effect on one's psychological well-being. So those are just two examples of causal comparative research, but the idea is that there are existing differences among different groups of people, and you're trying to determine the cause and look at some specific cause to it. But with this one, remember, you do interpret the results with caution. Don't be like the ancient aliens guy here who says there's actually no empirical evidence indicating it was aliens, but it was aliens. In other words, you do have to interpret results with caution because you are kind of looking at something that maybe you're just making something out of it that's not really there with causal comparative research. So that can be an issue. So those are not as strong. Causal comparative research results are not as strong as experimental research results. And in experimental research, you have cause and effect relationships that you're trying to determine. This is the strongest research for determining cause and effect relationships. And the reason why is because the researcher, him or herself, manipulates an independent variable and then controls for other relevant variables. And the researcher controls selection and assignment. And so they randomly assign different groups of people to a different condition, and then is able to just manipulate one variable from one condition to another. And you have a control in which that variable is not manipulated or are usually the same as what it might be otherwise. And then you have a treatment condition where that variable, the independent variable, is manipulated by the researcher, and then you can determine what the differences are. You can run some kind of a test to determine what the difference between the two groups of people are. So it's the most generalizable of all the research and has the strongest cause-effect relationships, or makes inferences about those. So it says, this is the strongest way to tell whether something causes something else. But I would say too that the external validity of it might be a little bit less strong, because it's harder to, you know, it's harder to say that these things can be, that these conditions can be used again. It's hard to manipulate something and then say this is real life. It's less real life, I'll put it that way. So yeah, so in experimental research, you have an experimental or treatment group, and you have a control group. One example of this might be in the classroom. We have a lot of school classrooms. You might manipulate one classroom, and in that one classroom, a teacher is supposed to use some new technique. Let's say it's total participation techniques. And in the other classroom, they do not use total participation techniques. They just use what they had been using at the school before. And you are the one who told the one teacher to use total participation and the other teacher not to. And so you're the researcher. You manipulated those different treatments. And you can do a post-test and determine, let's say, student achievement after the end of the quarter or after the end of the unit. And that will tell you whether total participation is a maybe better solution than the previously used solution in the classroom. So that'd be one example, but important elements of experimental research are manipulation and control. So again, you are the researcher, you're manipulating independent variables and you're controlling all other variables. For instance, in the classroom example, you would want to control for anything else that the teacher might do differently. You want to make sure the two teachers are the same on everything else except for their use of total participation versus no total participation techniques. That way you can make stronger cause and effect statements saying this really, total participation really does cause students to have a stronger academic scores or whatever it is. You want to control any other variables. So some possible extraneous variables might be the time that students are in the school. Maybe the students in the total participation group actually the study ended up going longer before you took the post-test in that group. So that would be an extraneous variable, maybe the time, or maybe it would be different students, right? You have different students. Maybe you ended up with stronger students in the one class, and so they gained a lot more in the one class regardless of the technique or the variable. So you want to control for those kinds of things. And one way to just kind of built-in control things is to randomly assign students to different conditions. So in this case, you would want to randomly assign the students to the different classes instead of using the existing classes. Though in education research, there's this thing called quasi-experimental research where you don't randomly assign students, you just take existing classes and use those as your control and treatment groups. And it's not as strong, but it is still, a strong way to think about cause and effect. Some issues with experimental research are sufficient exposure to the treatment. A lot of times experimental research studies are only a very short amount of time that the person is exposed to the control or treatment. Let's say total participation techniques are used, but for only an hour. And in the other class, it was only an hour as well. And so maybe that's not sufficient exposure to really explore or to really tell that students really changed on what they're learning. And then another one is sufficient differences between treatments. So again, maybe total participation isn't very different than the other type of teaching that the teacher was already doing in the classroom. And so you have not a sufficient difference between the treatments to show that there was any kind of difference. So that's experimental research in a nutshell. Of course, you'll learn more and read more about these in the books as well. Single subject experimental research is another type of experimental research that is out there, but it's very different. It's a sample size of one student, basically, or one or a number of individuals that are considered as a single group. and it studies behavior change in response to treatment. And I think it's very educational in its focus. And yeah, each participant serves as their own control. And this is in cases where you might have the resources and need to work on someone's behavior and to improve that behavior over time, and to have some real one-on-one experience with that person to help them to improve their behavior. And so it's often used in special education type of settings where we have an individual who needs some help with improving their behavior, and we have the resources that we can give to them to give them that one-on-one attention and help them to improve. And you kind of check, you try an intervention, then you check to see how their behaviors have gone. Maybe it's through observations or through some kind of a assessment that you fill out about them. And then you try a different response, or maybe you remove the different intervention that you've tried and then measure again to see what the result is. Maybe they start doing the bad behaviors again after you remove the intervention. And then you put the intervention back in maybe, and then you see what the response is. Maybe they, again, improve their behavior. That's the hope anyway. And so you say, well, based on this study of this single subject experimental research study that I just completed with this one person, I think that we should try this intervention with them. And so it's really a focused and one-on-one type of research. So again, it's not as strong because it doesn't really relate to more than just the one person or one group that is in the study necessarily, right? You can't say something like, this will work with everybody. But you can say that, hey, this worked with this one student, so maybe it's something to try on students who are much like this student, or this group that is much like this group. So single subject experimental research. So those are the 3 different research types you'll learn about this week, and I just wanted to give an intro to them so that it will help you kind of have an organizer in your mind of how these different methods work.